Welcome back to another modern budget deck tech by Giant Monster Games. Today we are doing Elemental Aggro. This is a mono red deck that's going to run you around $63. Let's get into it, starting with creatures. The first three creatures we have all fall within the same category. I'm going to call them Haste Trample Beaters. The bottom of this curve is Spark Elemental. We're running 4 copies of this because it costs 1 mana, and it is a 3/1 with haste. So we can play this on turn 1 and get some damage in, or we can use it with some late game shenanigans we have going on. The second creature in this category is Hellspark Elemental. We're running 4 of them. Again, it has Trample, it has Haste, it costs 2 mana, but it also has Unearth, so we can play it out of our graveyard later in the game. And our last beater is 4 copies of Ball Lightning. It costs 3 mana, and it is a 6/1 with Trample and Haste. As you can see, all 3 of these creatures have one thing in common, and it is the fact that we must sacrifice them at the beginning of our end step. As you can guess with these creatures, we are literally just going to be super aggro. Put them on the table, swing for faces. We're not going to be holding on the block because that's not an option, but we do have some shenanigans that I'll talk about a little bit later. Next, we have 2 creatures that are providing us with some mana ramp. The first is Generator Servant. We have 2 copies of this. It is the less preferred mana ramp card because we have to sacrifice it and we can only get colorless mana, but it does allow us to play some bigger creatures earlier in the game. The second mana ramp creature we have is Smokebraider. We're playing 4 copies of this, and this is a creature we want to see on turn 2. If we can play this on turn 2, then we can play our 4 and 5 drops on turn 3, which means our deck becomes bananas amount of crazy, and the aggro gets real. Speaking of 4 and 5 drops, we have 4 copies of Thunderblast. This is a 5-drop creature, so it does cost a lot of mana, but it is also a 7/2 with haste, and it has persist, which means if it dies, it comes back to play with a -1/-1 counter on it. Next, we have 2 copies of Nova Chaser. This is a 10/2 creature with Trample that costs 4 mana to play. The one downside to this creature is it has Champion an Elemental, which means when it comes into play, we have to exile one of our elementals, and then that elemental returns to play if this creature dies. As you may have already guessed, all of our creatures are elementals, so this isn't really that big of a requirement. Especially with our next creature, Flamekin Harbinger, which we're playing 4 copies of, which we can use to tutor for Nova Chaser. When Nova Chaser comes into play, we target this card, which means when Nova Chaser leaves play, we get a tutor for another elemental. We can also use this to tutor for any one of the 31 elementals in our deck if we need the mana ramp, or if we need another big creature such as Thunderblast. And the last creature we have is 3 copies of Incandescent Soulstoke. This is doing 2 things. It's giving us an Anthem effect, so all of our elementals get a little bit bigger, meaning more damage. It can also be used to cheat in our big creatures, such as Nova Chaser or Thunderblast. Moving on to spells, we are playing a total of 10 instants. The first one is 4 copies of Lightning Bolt. Easily the best damaging spell in the game, so we might as well play 4 copies of it. Next, we have 4 copies of Temur Battle Rage. Means we're going to be giving our creatures double strike, so that 6/1 lightning ball that comes in is now going to be doing potentially 12 damage. Also, it's not that hard for us to trigger that second ability, meaning we can give some of our bigger creatures trample, meaning they can't just be chump blocked. And the last card we have is 2 copies of Fling, which is a very strange card to put in any deck, but it works perfectly in this one. An additional cost to playing Fling is we must sacrifice a creature. Seeing as a lot of our creatures need to be sacrificed at the end of the turn anyways, this is already going to get a little bit of extra value out of them. What Fling does is it deals damage equal to that creature's power to target creature or player, basically turning our creatures into damage spells. And if we're feeling really ambitious, we can always burn off Nova Chaser to deal 10 damage to our opponent. And lastly, moving on to lands, we don't have anything too special, just 19 mountains. How about our sideboard? We have 3 copies of Hell's Thunder, 4 copies of Smash to Smithereens, 4 copies of Sunflare Shaman, 2 Tormod's Crypt, and 2 Tyrant of Discord. And that is Budget Elemental Aggro. If you like this deck tech and want to see more budget decks, please consider subscribing to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. But before we actually end the video, let's move into lines of play and then a couple upgrades for this deck. Prioritizing getting your mana ramp creatures into play before you start playing your aggro creatures is usually a good idea, because it allows you to set up for bigger plays. Playing one of your haste trample beater creatures and then getting Temur Battle Rage on it is definitely a better play because you're going to get that extra damage in, or it's going to be chump blocked and you'll take out whatever that creature is and get extra damage in, which is better than burning off all your aggro creatures right on turn 1, 2, and 3. Flamekin Harbinger is a ringer in this deck. It allows you to tutor up your big creatures, or it allows you to tutor up that mana fixing if you don't have enough mana. So play it wisely and aggressively. And lastly, Fling will get you a little bit of extra value out of your creatures, which you can use to target either your opponent or a creature that's on the battlefield that you need to get rid of. Let's talk about a couple upgrades for this deck if you have some extra money to spend. The first change I would recommend is to have 4 Nova Chasers and 2 Thunderblasts. Nova Chaser is a $5 card, so for cost's sake, I only put 2 in this deck. I actually considered putting 0, but I think it's actually a necessary component to make this deck really win. The next card to add in, and it's a little bit more of a sideboard card, would be Fulminator Mage. It allows you to destroy non-basic lands that your opponents are playing. This becomes extremely helpful in games against multicolored decks or against Tron, and it'll actually shut those decks down extremely quickly, and not too much cost to us. We're okay with losing a creature here and there. And that's really it. This deck already runs about as hot and fast and cheap as it can possibly get. If there's new cards that come out in future sets, I will come back and revisit this deck, but right now, this is actually going to be it. I hope you enjoyed this budget modern elemental aggro deck. If you did, I would recommend subscribing to this channel for more budget deck techs coming out every week. And like always, don't forget to game like a giant monster.